All right, before we start today's lesson, I had an epic brain fart. This is asking you to look at equal ratios and percents. That is not what that should say, so cross out that word percents. I'm going to have you write the word proportions, because that's actually what we're talking about today. That was my mistake, so sorry. So we're going to talk about ratios and proportions. We talked about ratios yesterday. Proportions is just going to look at the relationship between two ratios. So a mathematical statement that two ratios are equal to each other is actually what we call a proportion. You might have heard of things being proportional to each other, meaning how they relate to each other. Proportions, when we talk about ratios, are going to be very similar to equivalent fractions. And I say very similar because we do have two other forms that we can write our ratios in, but if we write them as fraction form, then it's pretty much going to be exactly the same as equivalent fractions, which you guys are pretty much pros at. But it has been a while, so this might be a good refresher for you. So you can tell if two ratios are proportional by converting or changing one into a fraction with the same denominator. So let me give you an example here. Yesterday we used, I had 6 waters for every 2 sodas. Or we'll do this way. 2 sodas for every 6 waters. If I had 1 soda for every 3 waters, is that going to be the same? Well, to do that, I have to change one of my fractions. Let's go ahead and change this guy. I want him to have the same denominator as him. So I'm going to multiply him by 2, which gives me 6. Whatever I do to the bottom, I got to do to the top. Because when I multiply them by the same thing on the top and the bottom, it gives me the same answer. I know that these are actually equal ratios, which you guys have heard of as equivalent fractions. Like I said, pretty much the same exact thing. Same thing. I also could have changed this into 1/3. You can also find out if things are equal ratios by putting them in their simplest form. So by dividing till they're smallest and can't be reduced anymore. So to write an equal ratio, because sometimes you'll be asked if two ratios are equal, sometimes they'll just give you a ratio and they'll ask you to make an equal ratio. You simply multiply both parts by the same number. So again, let's say we had 2 sodas for every 6 waters. An equal ratio to that, I could multiply by any number. Let's say I want to multiply by 4. So for every 24 waters, I'm going to multiply the top by 4, then 2. I can have 8 sodas. This also works if you want to divide by the same number. So let's go ahead and jump right down into our problems. The first one looks like your top 3 problems, and that's going to be like the first part of our notes where it's asking if ratios are proportional. So the first one is 7/14 and 12/24. I want them both to look the same, and like I said, if you put it in fraction form, you guys are going to be able to recognize it a lot easier. So we'll leave 7/14 the same way it's supposed to be, and we'll change 12/24. All right, this one's kind of a stinky one because 14 doesn't easily go into 24. So let's go ahead and try our next step, which was saying you could put them in simplest form, and see if that makes it any easier. 7 and 14, 7 goes into both of those, so I'm going to divide them both by 7, and I'm going to end up with 1/2. 12/24, lots of numbers go into those, 2, 3, 4, 6. I'm going to use the number 12 because it's the biggest number that goes into both. And when I divide both parts by 12, I get 1 for my numerator, 2 for my denominator. So I notice when I put them in simplest form, they both equal 1/2. So I need to go back and answer my actual question. It wants to know, are these proportional? There's only 2 possible answers, yes or no. In this case, when I simplified them, I got the same fraction, which means these are equivalent. They both equal 1/2. So I'm going to say yes. All right, the next problem doesn't quite look the same. The next problem looks like your bottom 3 problems, where you're gonna have to write an equivalent ratio in all 3 forms, which is what I did here. I just wrote an equivalent ratio. I just have to write it the 3 different ways. Word form, with our colon, and also as a fraction. So the first one, I'm gonna go ahead and pause and try this. All right, you guys could have totally different answers from what I have. The biggest thing I want you to make sure is that you're doing pretty much the same steps and making sure you have it written 3 different ways. So for 5 to 10, let's say I'm multiplying both by 2. That's a nice easy number. I'm going to end up with 10 to 20. I'm going to end up with 10 to 20 and 10 to 20. You could have come up with completely different numbers. You could have multiplied by 5 and came up with 25 to 50. You could have multiplied by 10 and came up with 50 to 100. You could have divided by 5 and came up with 1 to 2. Any of those are acceptable, including many, many more. So like I said, you have 6 problems. The first 3 look like this. The second 3 look like this. So I need to see yeses or nos for each of these, and I need to see some work. Don't just guess. And down here, if I don't see all 3 forms for my new equivalent ratio, you will not be given credit for doing it tonight. Thank you.